Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Bishop Bryan Ouellette coming to you live from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on this September 7th, 2018 for Vestiges After Dark. Hope all of you are having a wonderful evening so far. We're about to have even a better evening as we discuss tonight legendary creatures. This is fantastic beasts and where not to find them. We'll be talking about the authenticity and metaphysical realities of 6 various types of legendary creatures. And then we'll be taking your questions as usual. Stay tuned. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us tonight on this edition of Vestiges After Dark. I want to apologize for the hiatus last week, but I was away out of the country with my family and getting some much-needed rest and relaxation. As you can imagine, is very important in maintaining optimal health in the work that I do. Being an exorcist definitely has its disadvantages in terms of the adverse effects it has on your own health, just the nature of the type of work it is, and the consequences of always coming into contact on a regular basis with various dark forces. And relaxation is honestly one of the best protections against it. If you overwork yourself, you become more vulnerable. So that's where, or what I was doing, so getting some much needed rest. But I also was joking with some of you on Twitter that this is good training for you, because if we are successful in getting my reality show sold to a network, my time is going to become even more precious and more of a commodity as it goes on. Not to mention that as I become more well known and the Twitter following increases, I'm finding that even at just under 6,000 followers, it's getting a bit difficult sometimes to manage all the questions coming in. I can't even imagine, what it's like when you're at 50,000, 100,000, a million. So, we'll do our best, but, enjoy the time that we have now, because if that were to happen, and I certainly hope that it does, because we're going to be able to help so many more people than we can now, we'll have resources to be able to travel and meet up with people who otherwise would never be able to receive help from this ministry. So, overall, it's a good thing, but it will definitely change the dynamic a bit. But we will keep Vestiges After Dark going, even if it is cut back somewhat from what it is today. But for right now, we can enjoy it. So I want to thank all of you for logging into the chat room there. Hopefully my chat room will not conk out on me as it has for the last couple of shows. But I think you're going to find that the sound is a lot better tonight than it has been in the past. We've worked out some things and we've made some new discoveries. And I think you're going to find that even my co-host, Joy Keeling, is sounding the best that she's ever sounded to date. So, Joy, how are you doing this evening?
Well, I am super excited.
Yeah, this is a topic for you, isn't it?
Yes, I've been counting down for actually since we came up with the topic. I've really been counting down since then.
Awesome. Well, you're going to be instrumental, I think, in covering some of this. I know that you have a lot of background information on these topics, or at least the 6 types of creatures that we will be discussing tonight. And I think the audience is in for a treat. Just because this is kind of a unique topic, and I like, again, this is one of the benefits and advantages to this new show, because this is just not something that I'd ever really cover on Vestiges of Christianity. I mean, even though there is some loose application there, overall, it's not really a topic for a theological show, but Vestiges After Dark allows for this, since this is mostly a paranormal show, and there really is nothing more paranormal than some of these creatures. And I know that a lot of people out there that follow me on Twitter and really interact have been asking questions from time to time over the past couple of years about things like werewolves and vampires and whether or not these things really exist. I mean, certainly we know that there are subcultures of people out there that consider themselves to be vampires, and it's kind of part of that whole goth culture to an extent, and there's certain elements of it that I would admit I do not understand, but there's a psychology to it, and there are people that are attracted to this type of thing, and all the power to them. But there is also a metaphysical side, and that's essentially the part that we're going to be covering tonight. And we'll take questions. So feel free throughout the show to ask questions in the chat room. Of course, you can try to blast us over on Twitter as well. I know that I look at it loosely, and I know that Joy does the same. So hopefully we'll catch a question if it comes in that way. But the chat room is really the best way. Log in to the Spreaker service, and that way you can come directly into our private chat and communicate with us directly there. And for those of you who are, missing the show and catching it in the archives, know that there's many ways that you can find the show. I don't know what your preferred method is, but we are on YouTube, we are on iTunes, we are on Google Play, we are on iHeartRadio. Well, no, iHeartRadio still not for this show yet. It's about to come. I think we need one more episode before iHeartRadio will take the show. But Vestiges of Christianity is on there. And I don't know, I want to say there's one more that I'm not thinking of. Oh, you can find us also on Nicolean.org. You can listen directly there. But the archives are also connected to the YouTube archives. So there's lots of ways that you can catch the program if, for some reason, you're not able to listen live. I know that it is late for some of you on the East Coast. But that's when I'm coming alive. So, it actually works out well. And I know we have a lot of listeners from the West Coast. So overall, it's a good time for them. But let's go ahead and let's just dive right in here and just find out, what we can discover about this topic. Because I know that Joy has a lot that she can teach me about these things. And I have a unique perspective on them as well, because there is a certain level of usefulness in the ministry that I conduct. You will find that as we talk about these particular creatures that we are discussing tonight, and I mean we're generalizing this show to legendary creatures, but there's literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them, that there's no possible way that you could ever cover each and every one of them. So I picked 6 of my favorites, and some of that had to do with popularity and how pervasive they are within human consciousness, because you're going to find also that there's some surprising elements to their authenticity, not maybe what you're thinking, not maybe what you're expecting. And I'm hopefully going to be able to shed some light on what these creatures really are in truth. And in some cases, I think it will be surprising to some of you. Now, to my students who take my webinar, probably not, because we cover this type of thing fairly early. Actually, I think we covered most of what needs to be known about this in Unit 1. So very early in the webinar series that I teach every week to my loyal students, they already know much of what I'm about to talk to you about tonight. But I know that the greater majority of the public are not aware of these things and not really understanding how to look at these things because they have fallen into the realm of fiction. Part of that is Hollywood's fault. Part of that is just the very nature of good fiction, good storytelling. And now when we look at things that come from folklore and various realms of mythology, that mythos to us appears to be pure fiction. And that's why we even refer to this in a sense as legendary beasts, because there's more legend to them now to us than they are real. You're not going to find too many people that believe in mermaids, but there's a lot that are interested in the paranormal that wonder, is there some truth to it? Well, hopefully we're going to answer that tonight. I know some people are asking, where's Sister Mary Jones? Sister Mary Jones also on holiday. So she will hopefully be in the chat room for our next edition of this show. But tonight she is enjoying family, as I was last week. And boy, was it a wonderfully restful time, I have to say. There was a vacation, the first vacation I've taken in a long time, where I literally planned it to do absolutely nothing but eat and drink. And that is the best. I've decided that is the best kind of vacation there is. Better than sightseeing, better than theme parks. There's really just nothing better than a fine meal, a good drink, and plenty of rest and relaxation in the sunshine. Honestly, that does wonders for the soul. So I think we'll be doing a lot more of that in the future, and I'm sure my wife Tracy agrees. Okay, so let's get started here. The topic of that I'd like to start off with, I think, really is the werewolves. And I know that some people on Twitter, when we mentioned this, started freaking out. The werewolves freaked them out. And, Harry Potter did a fantastic job. That whole Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling did a wonderful job with her portrayal of werewolves. In fact, that's part of why I like the Harry Potter series so much is that she draws so well from the mythos of European history, and certainly werewolves come out of European folklore, although there are similar beings reported in the Eastern cultures as well. They don't refer to them as werewolves, but they're essentially the same thing. And just to give you some background on this, they essentially come out of pre-Christian Europe. There was an understanding that there were creatures that were shapeshifters, and werewolves were considered to be a type of shapeshifter. Only this particular one would be the natural form would be the wolf, and then they could transform themselves when it was beneficial for them to do so into a humanoid form, although they were never really entirely human. It was more like an act, and then that evolved into what Christian Europe, and then you start to see more and more talk about these things during the Middle Ages, very closely associated with witchcraft, very much associated with the devil. And from Christian medieval times, witchcraft, Satanism, or Satan in general, and anything that came out of that particular lore were all closely related for the church. So werewolves were not a good thing to the mind of the medieval Christian, and it was essentially they were seen as witches who were cultivating this ability to transform themselves into animals. So kind of the inversion of the origination of the pagan way, where it was starting as an animal that could fake being a human. This was more like a human that could fake being an animal. And they would use shape-shifting techniques through magic and witchcraft to be able to conduct their malevolent activities, or however it was seen.
And there were also the berserkers of the Vikings. Some of them followed the bear, and some of them were more connected to wolves.
Yeah.
And they would wear the pelt of whatever creature and believe that they were taking on the characteristics of that animal. And it's kind of similar to what like a Native American shaman would do in connecting with the spirit of the animal.
Yes. And that's essentially where its core origination is. It was never considered at the start to be an evil thing. It's just, the church would always take things that it saw as against its Christian principles, which was pretty much anything pagan.
Right. Exactly.
The pagans could not do anything right to medieval Christians. There just was no connection point. There was no respect, to that older way. And so it was, very common to demonize anything that came out of that time period. Anything that was even remotely associated with the paganism was associated eventually with the devil. And we still kind of see that today in Christianity. You see it in fundamentalist circles. You see it in evangelical circles. This is why even to this day divination is condemned. It's not just because there's certain passages in the Bible that sort of call these things out. It goes deeper than that. And you have to understand, from the church's vantage point, which evolves out of ancient Judaism, the Jews, having been heavily persecuted by everyone else, which is basically at the time all pagans from every corner of the Jewish world, wanted to separate themselves as much as possible from anything pagan. And so, things like divination or anything pagans did, connecting with spirit animals, as you just mentioned, was going to be frowned upon, and Christians unfortunately inherited this. But it was never considered to be evil, and pagans were definitely not doing it for evil purposes. It was just seen this way from the eyes of those in the church, and then, of course, from more of the primitive church. But what is a werewolf, and really, how do you become one? So, generally speaking, the ordinary way, or I guess the pop culture way, to get bit by one, and that you see as pervasive in many sources throughout history as to how this were to occur, for those individuals that did not want the condition of lycanthropy, but so you had witches. There was one group, the witches, that cultivated this ability, and essentially, they could do it by simply stripping down Skyclad and putting on the fur of whatever creature they wanted to become. In this case, it would be a wolf. And it's really unfortunate that Sister Mary Joan is missing this episode, because she loves wolves, and she has a Native American spirituality to her through her ancestry. So she would definitely enjoy, I think, this topic. She'll want to listen to the archives. I'll have to let her know.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so that would be, the way that one very simple way to cultivate it is as simple as just simply putting on the skin of the animal, and then allowing. And
they would also put on an ointment, and generally it was a hallucinogenic ointment that was designed to get them into that spiritual mode. Again, a lot like Native American shamanism.
Yeah.
Going on a spirit journey.
Absolutely. I really think that's where this really starts out. And it actually, ironically, is where it ends as well, as we'll see here in a moment.
Mhm.
Getting bit by the animal likely was a rudimentary or evolved out of a rudimentary ancient understanding of rabies. The idea that
Yes.
you could have, if you got bit by an animal, you could contract a rabies. And rabies, for those of you who are not familiar with the symptomology, it actually does make the person who gets the condition beast-like. The foaming at the mouth, for example, the hallucinations and various other aspects of it drives them insane. And of course, without the proper treatment, it's fatal eventually. And of course, in the ancient world, it was absolutely fatal. So, certainly this might have been part of where that whole lore comes from. Getting bit by the werewolf would turn you into one. But in reality, the beginning and end of what a werewolf is, at least in terms of how we would look at it metaphysically, is a type of astral projection that a very skilled ceremonial magician or somebody who knows how to practice this, which would fall into the category of even modern day shamans, authentic ones, not the the New Age bookstore ones. I'm talking about the ones that actually belong to a real tribe and have made a life commitment to serving their tribe in this capacity. That connection to the spirits of animals is of course evolves out of the most ancient religion, animism, and will lead to the ability to take on that spirit form in what we would sort of loosely classify as the astral plane. I don't like using that terminology because it sort of sounds a little bit more ethereal than it is. Really, what I like to use is the word non-corporeal. And my students are probably so sick and tired of me saying that word, but it is the best word for it because there is two sides to our universe. You have physicality, which is all of course, everything that's governed by the five senses and everything that we would consider in scientific terms to be real. But then you have the non-corporeal, which is the realm of the mind, realm of thought, realm of feelings, and the realm of spirit. And then that astral thing that, you hear some people talk about, it really just falls into that same non-corporeal category. All of those things, the mind, the feelings, the thoughts, the spirit, it's all non-corporeal. And it's very much a governing part of our reality. I mean, let's face it. How can you say anything that goes on inside your mind is not real when just about everything that you feel dictates the rest of your existence? The choices you make, the careers you choose, even whether or not a person's going to thrive or fail in life, is ultimately comes back to how they feel. So, the non-corporeal world is a lot more important than the physical. And we don't really tend to see that because we're sort of conditioned from the time we're very young to just believe that everything outside of our head is the real world. And that's really the opposite of the real world. I love it when, again, to reference Harry Potter again, when in the seventh movie, I can't remember if it was part 1 or part 2, but it's when Harry, I think it's part 2, Harry dies and he meets Dumbledore in sort of that limbo state. It's kind of a train station. And, he has this sort of satisfying conversation with Dumbledore, sort of kind of brings closure to the way that Dumbledore and Harry's relationship ended. And at the end of the whole conversation, Harry, looks at Dumbledore and says, Headmaster, is this real or is this all happening inside my head? And Dumbledore responds to him, says, well, of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why should that mean it isn't real? And I love that line. That line stuck with me. That line stays with me because for those of us who work within metaphysics, those of us who, study it and practice it at a fundamental level and even have made a career out of it, as I have, we know that this is true. We know that the non-corporeal is where the reality is essentially at. I mean, how do you build a skyscraper? Does a skyscraper appear and then it enters our mind? Or does the engineer and the architects and all of the people that come together to build the building have to have the abstraction first? It starts out in someone's mind, and then it's created. Even creation itself follows that pattern we see in the book of Genesis with God saying, "Let there be light." It starts out as non-tangible words, thoughts and ideas being conveyed in tangible form through the word of God's voice. And that is essentially what is fundamental to magic. And by magic, I'm talking about magic with a K. I'm not talking about stage magic. I'm not talking about, pick a card, any card. I'm talking about ceremonial occultism, astral projection, and being able to control one's out-of-body experience is very much dependent upon the forms that one can harness when in this particular state of consciousness. And for those who are very deeply connected to nature, as most shamans are, in fact, as most shamans need to be, it is absolutely appropriate for them to take on the form of an animal or of their spirit animal. And in this case, with the form of werewolves, it would be the wolf. Not for malevolent purposes, but for spiritual enrichment. So,
Bishop,
yes.
I wanted to jump in.
Yeah.
It's been a long time, but back in the 90s, I knew a man who grew up on a Cherokee reservation. He was studying to be a shaman under his stepfather. He was a shaman of wolf. They both were. And they both focused on wolf, and they considered themselves to be werewolves. And I had seen at one point he transformed before my eyes to a point where he said that most people can't see when that happens. They cannot see it because they can't see the same types of things that would be showing these things. For everyone else, it looks normal, but I saw the transformation. And I think that might have been, partially because I was a medium, but also he said that those who do see it usually forget it after it happens. And I did not, and that surprised him a lot.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things, as we go deeper into this topic tonight and sort of discuss the nature of what these things really are on a metaphysical level, deals with the fact that we might wonder why in our modern day and age these things have been marginalized down to fiction when the ancients took them quite seriously. Why is that? Why? And we tend to just assume, modern man tends to just assume, with all of his wonderful enlightenment and science and atheism, simply just that they were less intelligent, or maybe not so much less intelligent, but less informed. They didn't have access to the knowledge that we have today, and didn't understand the world like we do today. That's the attitude. And I would argue that is absolutely a gross misrepresentation of the ancient world. In fact, I would say they were far more intelligent than we are today. They didn't have the weakness of technology to weaken their minds and create dependencies on things that can do the work for them. But they were more connected. Technology and science, while it's wonderful, it's definitely wonderful. I mean, look at where I'm able to broadcast and come into your home every week and give you this wonderful, discussion. This is technology that makes this possible. It's nothing else. So, it's got its good side to it. But the problem is that it has divorced us from our natural condition. And we are less aware and less capable of seeing that non-corporeal world that we have, through our conditioning, marginalized down to being all in our heads, just like Harry asking Dumbledore. And the thing about you, Joy, and when we call ourselves things like mediums or sensitives or psychics or whatever term is preferred, it sort of comes and goes with the trends, but they all mean the same thing. Pretty much. Really, what that is a person who hasn't lost their sight. They haven't been distracted to the point that the world around them has sort of etched it out of them. And it's sort of like an appendage that gets no use and it goes atrophy. So I would argue that there's no real such thing as a medium or a psychic or a sensitive. We all are those things. It's just most of us have never used it. So what happens when, use it or lose it, right? So what happens when you don't use a particular muscle? It atrophies. It no longer works. Eventually, they've even done studies, horrible studies, but they've done studies that were quite interesting for, at least if you're looking at it from a scientific vantage point. They there was a scientist, kind of sadistic guy, took kittens, and he blindfolded them from birth because kittens are born blind, and their sight sort of develops about a week or so after they're born. They start to get to see shadows, and then eventually their vision gets very acute very quickly. But initially they're blind. So what he did is he actually didn't blindfold them. He sewed their eyes shut. He actually stitched them shut so that they would not open, and left them like that for 6 months or a year. And then after 6 months to a year, he removed the stitching, and their eyes opened for the first time. And guess what? They were blind for life. They could never see. The sight never developed. And it's because they were deprived of, at that critical point of development, they were deprived of the natural ability to develop eyesight. This is what we're doing in our society to our children in terms of spiritual acumen. And for whatever reason, Joy, and for those like you who are now what we would call mediums and psychics and sensitives and so on and so forth, empaths, are basically people who, for whatever reason, were never allowed that conditioning to take hold over their natural sensitive abilities to see the non-corporeal world. And that's exactly why you were able to see that transformation. So are werewolves real? Of course they are. Are they what we think they are? No. It's happening at a non-corporeal level. Now, because I say that does not mean that it doesn't have the ability to manifest at a physical level, because it can. Now, whether or not we can see this today is again dependent upon how spiritually cultivated we are. And so at least in terms of werewolves, now the other creatures we're going to talk about tonight, some of them have different explanations. But when it comes to werewolves, what we are talking about are people that have been able to harness the spirit of a particular animal, in this case a wolf, and can so perfectly align themselves to it vibrationally that they can actually manifest the characteristics, even sometimes to the point of physicality, which is a fascinating thing.
Oh,
but
yes.
like you said, Joy, typically if a person were to see this happen, they forget. The psychic sensor protects them. Usually the mind cannot handle this information, and so it sort of just drifts into obscurity, making it
absolutely
legendary. Yeah. Yeah. Now there is a condition called clinical lycanthropy. It's actually a medical condition. It's a diagnosable condition in psychology, but unfortunately, what it refers to are people that have a psychological delusion that they believe that they're transforming them into animals, at various times. So psychology tends to look at it as a type of delusion or hallucination. And I have my own opinion on that. What I think it is a person who is so disconnected from their spiritual life that any spiritual perceptions that they have on this level actually cause madness, and they're not able to handle it. And it leads to, what we would consider mental illness. But I think it is actually clinical lycanthropy. Is I think actually a natural ability to shapeshift. They just don't know how to process the information, and they don't have the training or the spiritual skill to do it. So the result is mental illness. And I mean, obviously, what other options are there? Yep. Because we're living in a society that says this doesn't exist. This is not real. But of course it's real. It's just not real the way we think it is. And we tend to think that the external physical world is the real world. That's not the real world. The external physical world that we sense with our five senses is a shadow of the actual authentic world that is entirely non-corporeal. It's the opposite of what we think. When you understand that, these kind of creatures become a little bit more easy to process. So, I mean, Joy, any other ideas on werewolves before we move on? I know that you're just a storehouse of information about this, so I don't want to deprive you of any opportunity to mention more about them.
I can't really think of anything right now off the top of my head.
Okay, well, we can always come back to the werewolves if the mood strikes us. But for now, let's move on to our second favorites, which are vampires. And those are. This is big. I mean, let's face it. Vampires are huge. You had those. Dracula, of course. That's a big one in pop culture. There was that. It's Interview with a Vampire. That was my favorite one.
Oh yeah, yeah, those were good.
Yeah, they were. Tom Cruise and
Brad Pitt.
Brad Pitt, thank you. Yeah, Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, and then the girl from oh goodness, what was her name? Kristen Dunst.
Yes.
All did a marvelous job in that. I think that was
a great.
It really was.
I thought it was a great job.
Yeah. If you guys have not seen that movie, you need to see that movie. It's a great vampire movie. It really does a great job with the whole topic, and it gets into all of course, the lore and everything that you would expect from vampires. So but what we have to understand, where did the originations of vampires come from? Very different than what we see with werewolves. Werewolves, again, as we mentioned, came out of a very benign connection to the spirit world through shamanism and various ancient forms of religion, whereas vampires are a more modern invention, and not really even an invention, just a modern conceptualization, perhaps is a better word, that is almost always originally associated with demons and spirits. Okay, so where werewolves were a very specific type of thing, usually, either an animal that turns into a human or a human that turns into an animal. With vampires, we're dealing with an undead spirit or a demon. So this is where you get the idea of Dracula and his association with the devil. If you saw Bram Stoker's Dracula, you probably remember that iconic scene where he renounces God and thus starts the transformation into becoming this this creature of darkness.
Of course, I remember that movie.
Yeah.
I share a birthday with Winona Ryder, and my very first online handle was Mina.
Oh, really?
Because of the book. I had just read the book.
It's a great book. It's also
so since
a great
1994,
movie.
I've been using the name Mina, and there are still people who call me that to this day.
Oh, really? That's not a bad one. We'll have to do the numerology on that one too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a wonderful movie. It really definitely gives a certain realism, or at least a feel of realism. But as you'll see, I mean, what do we associate? With werewolves, you associate the protection against werewolves with the silver bullet. Okay, but with vampires, it's almost always the cross. I mean, you get the stake through the heart and stuff like that. But
garlic.
Yes, garlic too. Garlic is sort of like it just kind of like fends them off, but it's the cross that really gets them. And even with werewolves, even going back to the more modern concepts of werewolves that we see starting in the Middle Ages, exorcism was the method of choice for dealing with those suspected of suffering from lycanthropy. And vampires were also a thing that one could attack with the rite of exorcism. So what are they in reality? I mean, do these creatures really exist? Are they evil? And I think the answer is going to be kind of surprising. I know Joy's going to want to get into some more of the, the folklore, and we're going to definitely cover that. But I want to mention, before we even get into some of that, vampires are essentially every type of spirit attachment. Every type. That's essentially all it is. It comes out of spirit attachment. It's a concept that before they really understood spirit attachment, or I'm not even sure they still, largely understand spirit attachment. But most spirits that are stuck in this state of what, going into the classic lore is the undead, have to feed off of the energy of the living. And this is where we start to get a spirit attachment. When a person is literally being drained physically by a spirit that has latched onto them and is literally living off of their life force, or in Chinese, or as the Chinese would see it, the person's chi, which is real, by the way. And so any spirit that latches on this way, and let me tell you, there are thousands of different kinds that do this, would all be the originally contributing factor to the idea of the vampire. Okay. In some cases, if those of you who listened to the podcast that we did recently on the 4 types of demons, I'll mention them quickly here. You have obviously the fallen angels. They typically do not do vampire activity. Because that's just not, they don't really need our energy to survive. Angels tend to have a sort of immortal condition, unless, some type of supernatural intervention takes place. But overall, they don't need to eat to survive like we do. So fallen angels are the first category of demons, but they don't really do this type of vampire-like attachment. But then you have the primordial or elemental spirits. And most vampire-type spirits are going to fall into that category. You also have created and you have wrathful spirits. And wrathful spirits and created spirits, as we talked about on that previous podcast, and I don't want to get into or take time tonight to talk about it again, but you can go back and listen to that in the archives if you missed it. All of those 3 categories of demons can perform the activity of a vampire, which is to literally suck and drain the energy of their target victim. That's where it comes from. The idea of sucking the blood. Blood was seen in the ancient world to be the source of the vitality, and so therefore the folklore then exaggerated this concept, and in some cases it becomes literal, which is why you sometimes do see bite marks or scratches on victims of spirit attachments. A lot of people ask me, why am I being scratched? Why are the scratches? And it scratches that literally cause bleeding. Again, it comes back to the same lore. The ancients were able to recognize that this classification or type of spirit existed. They lumped them all into the category of vampire. But in reality, there were different types of species of spirits or non-corporeal beings, for if we're going to use a more technically correct metaphysical language or semantics. All comes from that same category.
Yeah,
So that's the reality of them. So what Joy, share with us what you know about them.
So I'm bursting at the seams here. So like, okay. So even in the ancients all over the world, from China, the Middle East, Africa, Egypt, they all acknowledge the idea of the hungry dead, which is why, like in China, you'll have, offerings of rice with the chopsticks placed in them. That's why you don't leave your chopsticks in rice, because that's a sign of leaving it as an offering for the dead, and you're not going to eat an offering to the dead.
Right.
And the whole concept behind feeding the dead was because if you didn't feed them, they would not have food for the afterlife, and they would come back and eat from you. So they would take your vitality and your energy and make you sick. And that's why many demons and many of the hungry dead were associated with particular illnesses, especially those that would leave you drained. So, maybe leave you pale, like you've lost blood. And it's something that has kind of carried over, and they used it more, I think in Eastern Europe, it was where it started flourishing, this idea of the dead actually rising from their graves and coming to get you instead of just their spirit coming at you. And that's generally where the vampire lore came from, where Bram Stoker learned about that and thought, hey, I can use this to write a book. Because it was already starting to get popular a little bit before that with other things that were written just before then. But he really dove into the mythology to bring forth this new creature.
To develop it into what it became for modern eyes.
And it used to be this hungry, dead spirit of your ancestors that wasn't being appeased.
Well, it's still even in Buddhism today. You have the six gati, and one of the gati are the hungry ghosts, which is a realm or a condition, really, that we could reincarnate into, which is disfavorable, obviously. It would be not one of the realms one would want to achieve to. But bad karma could result in becoming a hungry ghost. And it's not a far cry from even our concepts of limbo today, and what we've talked about on this show regarding, as I said, the afterlife and what to expect from the afterlife. We've discussed this before. It all comes back full circle, and some of these legendary creatures are basically archetypal manifestations of these actual states or conditions. It's just a way of representing it in a type of visualization that allows us to process the information more clearly. But I love what you said there about how the Eastern religions and Eastern cultures have always had a precedent for this. They've always understood this, and there's truth to it. Because, people ask me all the time about why do places become haunted? Why do people develop spirit attachments? Well, because they're food. And that's it. There's really no other way to put it. It's that you've got energy and there are spirits out there that want it. And the result for you as a living person is usually illness. It usually makes you very sick, usually nondescript illnesses that doctors can't treat. One of the things that we look for in exorcism ministry when we're trying to discern whether or not a person has a legitimate problem or whether or not it's medical on some level or even psychological, is whether or not the person gets better with prayer or with medicine. So it's like if they're following their doctor's treatment plan to the letter, which is important to us, by the way, we look and see whether or not it's having any positive effect. If it is improving their condition, then typically we say, well, stick to that, because then it lends some credibility to the idea that it's a medical problem. But when they go to or they have a long history of going to see doctors and they're, not getting any better, in fact, in many cases, they're getting sicker, And then that can be cross-referenced with some other peculiar symptomology that would not be representative of the type of condition that they're diagnosed with. And then thirdly, we then offer prayer and that has some type of reaction. Then we tend to take the idea that this person has a legitimate spiritual problem more seriously. And again, it gets back to this idea. So vampires, yes, they are very, very, very real. But there are many creatures. I would like to say vampires are not a species. They're not a type of spirit as much as they are an activity of certain spirits. So vampirism is a type of activity. Now, this has nothing at all to do with the Gothic lore and the subculture of vampires that exists as almost a type of underground alter ego persona. That's a different type of thing that actually arises more out of the modern archetype that was created by Bram Stoker, or at least developed by him. The caped, fanged type of, man. Some of these
individuals. I used to hang out with a lot of those guys.
Did you really?
Yeah, I used to hang out at the goth clubs in the late 90s, and I hung out with people in the vampire scene. I was one of them.
There you go. I mean, nothing wrong with it. But some go a long way. Like I've known of some that would actually have implants put into their teeth to make longer, more realistic looking fangs. I know some that actually do the drinking of the blood thing, but they don't kill people. They will sometimes it's done as like a type of sensuous thing with the significant other who's also into the lifestyle, and so they'll maybe prick the arm or finger of the significant other, and they'll suck on it. They'll suck on the wound. It's a thing. Again, it's not my thing, but
it wasn't really my thing either.
Yeah. And some don't even go that far. It's just one group that does, one type of group. But this is a whole different thing. This is an embodiment of the archetype more so than it has anything to do with the actual spiritual reality of it.
Yeah.
So that's vampires. Jeez, I think we're almost at the top of the hour, but we can start talking about it. Let's discuss the Loch Ness Monster. This whole topic came out.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, somebody on Twitter, you mentioned
Julie.
Joy. Was it Julie? Okay, Julie.
Yeah. Hi, Julie.
Oh, Julie's there in the chat room. Julie, This one's for you. This whole topic tonight came out of Julie asking us to talk about the Loch Ness Monster. So we're more than happy to accommodate that request. And so, Loch Ness Monster falls into the general category of sea serpent or sea creature, sea monster. Even the Bible talks about Leviathan. It talks about various beasts of the water, which, mostly today we tend to associate with maybe large whales or something of that nature. But Loch Ness is a place in the Scottish Highlands that, might have been connected to the ocean many, 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 many years ago, prior to the continents resting where they currently reside. So some have suggested that maybe Nessie is, I guess, the nickname of the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah.
Have suggested that maybe it was some type of dinosaur that, never went extinct and ended up getting trapped in Loch Ness, because Loch Ness is actually very, very deep, exceptionally deep. And, it's sort of a very dark water mass. It's not very clear, and you really can't see your hand in front of your face, down there. So it's a great place for a mysterious creature to reside. The earliest report, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, goes back to the 6th century, where there was a monk who was attacked by a creature at Loch Ness, and I want to say it was Saint Columba who witnessed this monster and did the sign of the cross and was able to force it through the sign of the cross to go back into the water. Some have suggested it's a very large catfish. There are some species of catfish that can get quite large. Some think it's a Greenland shark. There are some species of shark that do reside in such water masses. Some have even suggested it was an eel. There's no question that the monk was killed. The records seem to be pretty consistent, at least in terms of that aspect of it, that something that came out of the water killed this unfortunate soul. But, again, in those days, any kind of mysterious animal that was in the water that could do that would probably be given legendary monster status. And thus the legend of the Loch Ness Monster was born. And then, of course, there were reports all throughout the many hundreds of years that came after, even up to the modern era, some of which have been proven fraudulent, fake photography or people messing around, which you're always going to get. You get that with the Sasquatch. You get that with what's the one with the snow? What's the snowman one? I can't remember his name.
The Yeti.
The Yeti. Thank you. I don't know, it was on the tip of my tongue. The Yeti. You get these creatures tend to be faked often. People claiming to have caught one, and it turns out that it's just people messing around. For what reason? I have no idea. But they do. And of course we have a Nessie in America. Julie pointed out as well.
Champ in Lake Champlain, up around New York. We have our own kind of Loch Ness creature, and they say it looks about the same.
Yeah.
So it
kind of dinosaur-like.
So it could be a kind of similar species in each body of water.
It could be. I mean, we don't know. I mean, we do. I will say this. It's a scientific fact that we have explored our oceans less than we have explored space.
Yes.
So I'm sure that somehow that would fall into the category of these very deep lakes as well. And who knows what could really be down there. We've certainly found very incredible creatures at certain depths of the sea that we are not even sure how they're able to survive. It's really just a miracle.
Extremophiles.
Yeah, that's a great one. Those that live in boiling
there's all kinds of things that live in boiling temperatures and things that live in such dense pressure of the water, down below. And we don't know what all is down there. And that's one of the reasons why murky water like Loch Ness is, just great for stories like this, because we tell these stories and they keep going through the generations and they become legendary. And then if we see something, it's going to, even if it isn't the actual creature itself, it's going to pull those thoughts, those memories of the monster to our mind, and we're going to keep that alive.
Yeah. And that, as we will see towards the end of the show tonight, when we start to talk about some of the explanations for these things, or the general explanations for these things, you're going to find that it comes back to how we process archetypes, how our brain is wired for archetypal communication. And that's going to, I think, enlighten a lot of us and sort of rest our minds about certain things. But in terms of the Loch Ness Monster, I would say that there really isn't anything supernatural or spiritual going on there. I really do feel that the Loch Ness Monster is either a species of some type of natural animal that we have not discovered yet, or it is being mistaken for it is a species we do know that's being mistaken, or maybe exceptionally large version of it. I don't question that people have seen something there, and there's just too many stories going back too many hundreds of years to dismiss it entirely. But I don't necessarily think there's anything supernatural going on there either. But we are now at the top of the hour, and we're going to take our break here. This is Bishop Bryan Ouellette with co-host Joy Keeling, and this is Vestiges After Dark. We'll be right back.
I am able to keep pushing my limits, and all the drive that I have, well, I'm going the distance with you. I didn't know what I had till I knew what was missing, and everything that I dread, well, I built a resistance with you. Catch me when I fall, and I'll keep you on the ground. You were gone, I wish you'd stay. I could look at you for days. Time was well spent, that's when I knew that I need to spend my life here with you. Fast lane, I understand that you've been broken too many times, but I'll be waiting to make you lose from all you've taken. But if we listen to each other, I made our mistakes, then I can show you who I am, because I'm not the same. I'm better with you. I'm better with you. I'm better with you. Catch me when I fall, and I will keep you off the ground. That's when I knew that I need to spend my life here with you.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Bishop Bryan Ouellette with co-host Joy Keeling, and we're talking about legendary creatures. When we return here in just a moment, we will be covering the jinn. I've had personal experience with this one. Stay tuned. I don't know if my chat room has stopped again. It seems to only go for about an hour. I'm not quite sure why. But
well,
Joy,
they're having a dance party right now.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I'm glad that everyone's enjoying the music there. Try to keep it, a little bit lively for late at night like this, keeps us awake. But yeah, my chat room has ceased. I don't know. It goes for about an hour and then it stops. I don't understand that one bit. But I'm really not in a position to try to figure it out. So I will depend upon you, Joy, for any questions coming in.
Sure.
But, the jinn. This is an interesting topic. I mean, this could almost be a show or several in and of itself.
Totally.
Many people don't know much about them, but they've all heard something about them. We tend to, in the West, know about the jinn in terms of the genie in a lamp. That whole idea comes from this pre-Islamic Arabian concept. And it is definitely, from the Middle East, and it definitely predates Islam, even though Islam assimilated it. So now, Islam will talk about the jinn, but, it's definitely an earlier cultural phenomenon. What a lot of people don't understand, and this is something that we really need to drive home about this concept, is that even though we tend to associate the jinn with a type of evil spirit or demon, which is generally how Islam looks at it, the reality is that a jinn can be any non-corporeal creature. So technically speaking, any spirit, even an angel, is a jinn. Because a jinn by definition would be any object, whether it's an inanimate one or not, that cannot be experienced through the ordinary five senses. So as we were talking about earlier with the whole idea of there being, the corporeal world, and whether or not the corporeal world is the real world, or whether or not, the world of the mind is, any creature that is purely non-corporeal, in other words, they have no physical characteristics whatsoever, is a jinn. But we tend to focus, of course, on the dark side of things, and so more often than not, when you talk about jinn, you're talking about a demon of some kind. I've had personal experience with one. We actually had a client. In fact, we are still technically working this case, and I can't give too many details about it because it is not a resolved case for multiple reasons. And I don't want to reveal too much, but I will say in general terms, I'll talk about a little bit regarding it. And it was a client that had come to us with what appeared to be a demonic possession. But yet some of the characteristics of demonic possession were not present. So to the untrained eye, you might look at a client like this and assume that they're malingering, or maybe something else is going on there. But what was interesting about this particular client is that his family are Muslims. And we don't tend to get too many cases from non-Christian groups, but we do get them. And I think some of that also comes from the archetype of the Catholic priests. And when you have a spiritual problem that might be demonic, people, the first thought that comes to mind is go see the Catholic priest, because, they know what to do. Thank you, Exorcist film, because it kind of created that archetype, and I guess gave a semblance of reality to other people about it. But there is reality to it, because the Catholic Church has had a long history of experience with this type of thing, more so than any other group, really. And so there is some truth to the fact that Catholics are good ones to go to for getting these problems resolved. But so this Muslim family came to us and wanted help. And we always interview our clients and try to get some backstory, try to figure out the origin of their problem, because that tends to reveal a lot about what the problem may very well be, particularly if it's an authentic spiritual crisis. It's nice to know that origin point. When did the problem start? Because, we need to kind of trace things back. It's a bit of a mystery even, to trace back to find out what really is going on there, what is causing this individual's discomfort. And they lived for a period of time in Saudi Arabia when he was a child. And when he was a child, one day, he disappeared. They didn't know what happened to him. He just did not come home. And 3 days later, he was found wandering in the desert, not knowing who he was or where he was or how he got there. But he was brought back to the family, and that from that point forward, he was never the same. So I asked him about that time. I wanted to know what transpired, when you were in the desert. What's the last thing that you remember? He didn't remember how he got there, but he did remember walking, and there was this dark mass, almost like a mist, that enveloped him. Came out of the desert, he saw it at a distance, and it approached him and then enveloped him, and that's the last thing he remembered. And, if you know anything about the jinn, well, they tend to live in the desert. They tend to be creatures that reside in the desert. They are often seen as a type of mist, or even found in sandstorms. And they are, going back to the pre-Islamic Arabian lore, a primordial entity, which, for all intents and purposes, for our categorization system that we use, that 4 types of demons that we've talked about, this would be an elemental spirit.
They're said to be made out of smokeless fire.
Yes. And that's kind of how he described it, really. He had a hard time trying to explain it, but if you read between the lines, that's more or less what he saw. Yeah. And I knew immediately.
It looks kind of like, that heat coming off of the road.
Yeah.
When you're driving down, that waviness to the air, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Incidentally, I've seen one.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, then there you go. And so, immediately, as soon as he mentioned, where he was, what he saw, and then some of the symptomology that we were witnessing while we were evaluating him, was obviously a jinn. Jinn, unlike fallen angels, need to eat. They are non-corporeal creatures, just like we are corporeal creatures. They are part of creation. They exist as an independent being. It's just they don't have any physical form. They are a non-physical being. And so they will, on occasion, target individuals and feed off of them, type of vampire in a sense. And so what the whole genie in the lamp thing is that a lot of times what individuals out there were trained to do is to capture them by putting them in a containment vessel, which was usually a type of bottle, in which case they could trap the entity or the jinn inside that bottle and then bury it in the sand so that they could no longer afflict anyone ever again, unless, of course, the bottle would resurface at some point in the future and the person would open it, and in that case they would be released. But they wouldn't get the 3 wishes. Generally speaking, they would get the wrath of the spirit and bad things would start to happen. Whether or not that's what happened to this client, we don't know, because we don't really remember. He doesn't really remember, other than he said he saw a mist coming to him from a distance and then it enveloped him. Probably was not in a bottle that he opened. But
one of the things that they say is no one knows what attracts a jinn to a human, but once it locks on, it never lets go. It could be something as simple as it falls in love with the shape of the person's eye. Yeah. That's one of the things that they say. And of course, eyes are a totally different type of symbolism in Arabian lore. It means something. So when it says that the jinn fell in love with the shape of their eye, it's falling in love with something associated with their perception.
And that certainly was true in this client, because the jinn would come through and and talk to us through him very eloquently, not unlike, a lot what you'd expect from a very, very intelligent being, and very different. Not that this client was not intelligent, but his normal means of communication was very different from when the jinn was talking. Different vocabulary, different syntax, everything was very different. Even an accent, it was different. And that was one of the things the jinn told us. Basically, he's not going to let go. Don't even bother to try. Any attempts that we would take to try to remove him would be futile. This, incidentally, was the origin of us creating the demon trap, which some of you might have. We've done a periscope at the church where I showed the outside of it. I would never open it. It should not be. The inside should never be seen. But it is what we created to actually trap this demon and remove him, because the conventional method of exorcism would likely be very ineffectual against the jinn. It's just not that type of creature. Not that the power of Christ couldn't have an effect on it. It would. But it wouldn't respond in the way that a fallen angel would. And so, again, that's part of the benefit, I guess, to the expertise of this ministry, is that we do tailor our resolutions according to the type of entities that we're dealing with, and we do not do a one-size-fits-all solution where a demon's a demon, so do an exorcism and get rid of it. It doesn't work that well in practice, and that's why a lot of times exorcism seems to fail, because the priest is not skilled or qualified to diagnose the type of spirit that they're dealing with, and they just fall under the assumption that all evil spirits are demons and fallen angels, and so of course exorcism is going to work, but it's not it's not necessarily going to be as effective towards the jinn as it would with a fallen angel. And so we have this demon trap, and we built it for the purposes of extracting this entity from this victim and trapping it, and we were going to give it an alternative to either leave or be destroyed. But we never got the chance. And I can't really go into the details as to why. We may get a second chance at this thing, because the problem obviously has not gone away, and the family is now seeking help again, thank God. But I don't know the developments. But that was a first-hand encounter with a jinn in this ministry by a person who lived in Saudi Arabia, where the jinn tend to be. So, Joy, I'm kind of interested. I'm kind of interested and curious about your encounter with one. Where were you, and how did you come in contact with one?
Oh, gosh, I'm not sure if I'm actually prepared to talk about it.
Oh, well, if you don't want to, don't feel pressured to. But I am curious. Is there anything you can tell us about it that wouldn't, reveal maybe too much?
It's really a lot like perceiving just, how they used to do like invisible things on like a TV show where you could kind of see that there's something there, but you can't see what it is because it's invisible, of course.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of like that smoke coming up, well, not the smoke coming off of but the wavy heat coming off of the ground.
Yeah.
Like if you're driving on the interstate, it's one of the things that you see in the desert. But in the desert, it could be the heat or it could be a jinn.
Right.
And one of the people in the chat asked if these are only in the Middle East. They're only called jinn in the Middle East. But these things are from every culture. I have found things analogous to these creatures in Native American lore and Celtic lore. The fairies and the jinn have so many similarities that there are some people saying they're the same entity. And I think maybe they might be, but because of where the people are located, they won't call it a jinn because they'll call it something else because that's what they're called in that culture. So yeah, I really think that because these are they're elementals that are as intelligent and even more intelligent sometimes than human beings. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, but they mostly are in the in-between spaces and they mostly want to be left alone. And if you don't leave them alone, you're going to face their wrath.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of even the very definition of jinn in the Middle East, which we started out saying and qualifying that, the jinn are any object, animate or otherwise, that cannot be seen with the use of the five senses. So essentially that's just a nice way of saying a non-corporeal being. Mm-hmm. So, jinn is just the term that is used out there, but, non-corporeal beings are everywhere. And there's various classifications of them, various levels of intelligence in much the same way that the animal kingdom that we can see operates. So, you have very simple life forms like mosquitoes that fly around and, feed off of you and can contract disease, but they're not intelligent.
Right. And then you have the jinn and the fairies who will kidnap your children, and you'll find them 3 days later wandering in a forsaken place where no one ever goes.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what happened with this client.
Yeah.
So, the desert, getting back to that question that I just wanted to expand upon, yes, they're everywhere, not only called jinn in the Middle East, but they are everywhere. But they do tend, this particular type, the one that would be classically recognized and understood to be a jinn, do gravitate towards warm, dry, and desolate locations like deserts. but you would find them in any desert. So I guarantee you that Death Valley is probably just as populated with jinn as.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I would not doubt it at all. Trickster spirits is what they're tended to be called in Native American. They tend to be the trickster spirits because they'll give you whatever you are wishing for. That whole wish idea, again, jinn and fairies.
Yeah.
They also grant
related.
Wishes.
Yeah.
And so people go to them wanting these wishes to come true. What they don't realize is what they do then is they take over your consciousness and put you in a dream state. There have been stories of, there was a story of a woman who was entrapped by a jinn spirit. She couldn't leave her house. When they found her, she was sitting on the floor, staring at the wall, talking to the wall.
Yeah.
And she hadn't been to work in weeks. And that's why they went looking for her, because she hadn't shown up for work. They didn't know what happened to her. And it was because she wanted so badly to have that lover, and she had him only in her head, and she could not stand up and walk because she was so trapped inside her head. And that's basically what the jinn do. And so that's how you end up with people lost in a trance in the desert.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly right. And I would say out of all the creatures that we've talked about tonight so far, the jinn are the most dangerous, and certainly the ones that are, how can I put this? They tend to be the most tangible of the ones that we've covered so far. There is a certain tangibility to them. They understand human nature almost better than we do. And so they can really, as Joy is indicating there, get into your head. And that's their strength, and that's our weakness. And that's what makes them so dangerous. And it's not a traditional demon, so you're not dealing with the same classification. You don't have the same tools against it, and it can be very difficult to remove them. I mean, but Islam actually has exorcism. It has a form of exorcism very different than Christian exorcism, but it does have a form of exorcism that is designed to remove jinn from unfortunate victims. But I have found that there are certain methodologies in ceremonial magic and occultism that are far more effective at extracting these entities and trapping them to be either destroyed or set free, depending upon the cooperative nature of the spirit. I'm always very willing in my work to accommodate. I use exorcism only as a last resort, because exorcism is an attack. So you'll find that most of the time, when I do work and somebody has an attachment of some kind, that I always start out with a blessing. I always try to empower them and enrich the person so that they can cultivate a stronger immunity against these types of attacks. And then once we get to know the spirit and understand what kind of spirit it is, that's when we will start to work with that spirit and give it options to move on, to leave voluntarily, so that we don't have to harm it. Because exorcism is very, it's an assault, is what it is. And the way that I do it, it ends in the annihilation of the offending spirit. It's not simply an extraction; it's an extraction and an annihilation. I feel that's the only responsible way to conduct exorcism ministry. I don't like setting these things free to go and harm someone else later on. That's doing no one any good. So I always work to annihilate the entity. But in cases like a jinn or something that's an intelligent elemental, I always give an opportunity for the spirit to leave voluntarily, and makes it my work easier, and it accomplishes the same end. And it's done through diplomacy over war. But sometimes that doesn't work, and you have to. You have to. Well, I can give you an example. I have an individual from Twitter who had a Gohazan, which is a scroll that in Buddhist culture contains an entity. Now, generally speaking, you leave this scroll in a place of honor, and you make offerings to it, and the entity that is contained within the scroll, which is not unlike the whole genie in a bottle thing, it's kind of, I guess, the Buddhist version of this, bestows various secrets to you that help to cultivate your faculties of awareness to aid you in the journey towards realization and enlightenment, which is, of course, the goal of Buddhism. They're not so much concerned about going on to paradise or some kingdom of heaven. For them, it's more about the cessation of phenomenon versus the indulgence in it. It's just basically, though, a different approach to the same general thing. So I don't get too bogged down in those types of distinctions. But the Gohazan is generally an aid. But like a lot of spirits that become sort of familiars or various other types of thought forms that can aid you in magical operations or spiritual operations, if you do not continue the relationship and feed these entities that require food, literally energy, something that they can consume energetically, which can even be alcohol or fruit or meat or even your own blood in some types of forms and rituals, then they get angry. They become sort of like the hungry ghost type of thing, and they become vengeful.
And they'll come back and eat you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then now the person's like, oh, now I have this attachment. What do I do? Well,
you go see the bishop. You go see the bishop,
and that's what this person fortunately did. Well, she didn't come to me, but she told me what was going on, and I said, well, send it to me. Send me the Gohazan, and I will take care of it. So, it arrived, and this is before we had our containment cabinet set up. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we eventually no longer delayed on the containment cabinet, because at this point, what I was doing is I was just storing these things in my garage, in a sealed part of the garage that I had ritually sealed. Problem with that, though, is that seals need to be constantly refreshed. Otherwise, eventually they break down. And if the entity so desires and happens to be particularly malevolent, it will escape and wreak havoc. Well, that's exactly what happened. I was a little neglectful and was not sealing it in as regularly as I should have. And this Gohazan get out. So just to keep in mind that I kept this thing in the garage until I was able to deal with it. And Sister Mary Joan and I, we are the ones that deal with these types of things. We're the ones that, make contact with the spirit and then give the spirit a choice, whether they have an opportunity to leave peacefully, and if not, they will be annihilated. And so we were waiting for the right day for us to be able to make contact with this Gohazan, and we were ready to make an offering. Sister Mary Joan has an exceptional bottle of very high-level Japanese sake that she doesn't drink sakes, but she has this bottle, and she said, I'll bring it over, and we will make an offering to the spirit and ask it if it will be willing to leave. And so we were prepared to do this. I think it just shows you the unconventional nature of our ministry, that, the lengths that we go through to respect this other side of reality that most people don't even know exists. It's important. It's part of the reason why I'm so successful in this work, because I have developed a reputation in the non-corporeal world for being reasonable and not this immediate aggressor that just rushes in and performs exorcisms on anybody. I do make contact, and I do offer alternatives to exorcism. In many cases, it's sufficient. But this Gohazan was impatient and wouldn't wait, and took the opportunity to get out of his sealed area, and that's when the havoc ensued. My wife and I both had smashed windshields on our cars days apart. The garage door, which is wired to both the security camera on that side of the house as well as to our alarm system, would open up itself and set the alarm off, and the cops would come, and, nothing would be there that they could find. And I was putting up with this until it eventually killed my cat. And that's when I drew the line. And so I went downstairs. I was pissed. And I told Tracy, my wife, I said, I'm not waiting anymore. And this thing has lost its opportunity. And I went in the back to the special part of my property where I build the Easter fire every year for the Easter Vigil. It is also where we prepare the holy fires to, for lack of a better word, execute spirits like this. And I threw it into the fire. And that picture is on Twitter. Those of you who know this story have probably already seen it. But you can, if you haven't, you can go to my Twitter and click on media, and you'll see a creature in the fire. Just go through some of the pictures there. Most of it's going to be the food that I eat.
That's one of my favorite pictures, though. Yeah,
it is a good picture, and that was the Gohazan actually burning. And unfortunately, the picture didn't do it justice. Because if you were there in real life, you could actually see what looked like flesh melting off of its bones. It was an absolute humanoid entity burning in the fire, almost as if we threw. It looked like it's really kind of grotesque, but it looked as if we threw a child into a fire, and we're watching it burn. And it's sad, but sometimes there is no negotiation with a spirit that has reached the point of becoming wrathful. And the only alternative at this point is to stop it from ever harming anyone again. And in this case, that's what I had to do. And I did it. And it's gone. So Gohazan's kind of like a very similar, basically an Asian version of the jinn. In this particular case, they start out good, and they can end evil if they're not properly taken care of. But I'd like to actually spend the rest of the show, and of course allowing time for questions, on the last one that we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Phoenix.
Woohoo!
I think this is my favorite. I don't know about you, Joy, but this is one of my favorite legendary creatures.
Did we talk about sirens?
Oh, we didn't, did we? Oh, my goodness. Oh. We better hurry then. Yeah, so let's talk about the Phoenix. Okay. Then we'll get to the science. So out of all of the ones that we've talked about, or that we're going to talk about, Phoenix is a good one. There's not a malevolent bone in the Phoenix's body. Essentially, the idea of a Phoenix was developed in Greek culture, but almost everyone agrees that the origins are from Egypt, which makes sense. Because Egypt's obsession with eternal life, which essentially is where the Gnostic influences through Hermetic Gnosticism as well as Sethian Gnosticism, which most likely developed by Hellenized Jews in Egypt, were brought over to Judea and then eventually bled into the Essenes, which most likely became the rudimentary understandings of Christian theology and the whole idea of eternal life and resurrection. All started in Egypt. The phoenix was associated with the sun. Again, the sun was one of the highest gods, or the highest god, Ra, in Egypt, and the phoenix was almost a representation of them, as well as even in esoteric Christianity is a representation of Christ, because the phoenix is the bird that dies and then rises again from its own ashes. It's the same bird every time, and it lives forever. I think there's most reports about the creature is it lives 500 years before that happens, so it essentially only has to rise from the ashes once every 500 years or so. Although there are different reports in different cultures, and there's even by different names all throughout the world. The Chinese have a phoenix. They don't call it a phoenix, but it's essentially the same thing. Same creature, does the same exact thing. Again, immortality is a big part of Taoist philosophy. In fact, they have the immortals in Taoism, and the phoenix is an aid to that in much the same way that we would associate Christ with our resurrection figure. And the phoenix is sort of the spirit animal of that whole idea. Wonderful, wonderful. It's just a wonderful symbology. It's a wonderful archetype for.
Well, yeah.
For
I
us.
mean, it lives for hundreds of years, and then it dies and comes back as itself, but it's now a new doctor.
Yeah, it's like the Doctor. It is
With
like
new
the
companions.
Yeah, new companions. Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but you're right. It is sort of like the Doctor. Well, I mean, that archetype is perfect. I mean, the Doctor Who is sort of a Messiah type archetype, is it not? I mean,
yeah, totally.
Resurrects. Saves everybody. Or at least tries to. So he's a god. He's kind of godlike in a way. So I don't know. Do you have any other ideas? I mean, anything else to add on the Phoenix?
No, that hit me and wiped out everything else.
Doctor Who. The thing is though about the Phoenix, and I think that's important to mention here, is again getting back to whether or not this is an actual creature or whether or not it's a myth. And what I want to make sure that we understand here tonight is that all of these things are representations of archetypes. Now, I got a question on Twitter that's perfectly applicable to what we're talking about here. And somebody asked me, let me see if I can actually pull it up. It wasn't that long ago. Let me see. It was while I was away, and I got it when I came back. I think it was while I was away, but let me just almost there. Let's see. Oh yeah, here it is. Somebody asked me, it was Jedi asked me this. I don't know if she's in here in the chat room tonight, but she asked me, why does a demonic entity present itself with a goat's head as one of God's creatures and not one of its own creation? And so my answer to them was two reasons. One, Satan is a bastardized imitation of God. He is a creature himself, and he's no creator. Okay, so the first reason is that Satan is not a creator, and we need to stop equating Satan to God, because that would be dualism, which would be more appropriate to Zoroastrianism than to Christianity, where there is only one God, and Satan is a creature under God. He's an angel, fallen as he is, but still a creature, and limited by the virtues of being just a creature. He's not a deity. He's not a god. And we tend to give him godlike status, which is exactly what he wants. It makes him more, it satisfies his ego, which is, really what the whole problem is here. So that's number one. But number two is the more important answer, and that is non-corporeal beings appear to our corporeal faculties of perception via an appropriate archetype that our brains can understand. So when we are talking about things like werewolves, vampires, phoenixes, these creatures, because there is no way for our minds to wrap themselves around the reality, because they're purely non-corporeal, and we're both. We're non-corporeal, which is our spiritual nature, and we're corporeal, which is our physical nature. And so we tend to spend most of our time in our physical world. We don't really again, because of conditioning. We're designed, we design our children to be, to live outside of their heads instead of inside them. It's both good and bad. Really, we should create more of a balance between the two, but that's just what we do in our society today. We consider the real world to be the one that we all share together outside, not the one that we experience as a singular reality within. So the way our minds work and connect to this non-corporeal world is through an archetypal language. And these are the archetypes that Carl Jung identified in various forms as the shadow, the eternal child, the great mother. These are archetypes, the trickster. These are all archetypes that are pervasive in every culture and in everyone's mind. They're there. They live there. And they resonate with us on a deep level. All of our stories are about these creatures. All of them. Every single one. The names change. The images change. But the archetypes remain the same. The hero, for example, that's an archetype. Okay? Most of our stories are about heroes. We love them. We love them because that's what resonates with us, right? So when we are dealing with a non-corporeal creature like a jinn or a phoenix, they don't have physical form, but they do have non-corporeal characteristics that our brain, being corporeal, because our brain is an organ, it might help connect us to our non-corporeal reality, which is where our thoughts and feelings come from. But ultimately, it's still a physical organ made up of neurons and, made up of cells. Just very special kind of cells that can conduct energy and process energy and convert energy into experiences. And we call that, the synaptic response. But in reality, the brain is still just a physical organ. So it doesn't know how to process that information. So we have archetypes to help us. So when you encounter a creature that's non-corporeal, you're going to see it through the lens of your archetypal understanding. And because, Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, his counterpart, his Antichrist, his evil shadow archetype, is going to be the scapegoat. That's how our minds are going to perceive it. That further became a problem when, in the Middle Ages or so, again, the gods of conquered religions tend to become the demons of the conquering religion. And so you had the god of the hunt in pagan Europe that was a horned god. And of course, he was a horned god because animals represented sustenance, survival.
He was generally associated with the stag.
Yeah,
in his most fertile form.
In his most fertile form, yeah.
Yeah.
And so Christians looked at that and said, "Oh God, that must be the devil," because they already were operating at the archetypal level of experiencing the devil in goat-like form, which was sort of a bastardized lamb. More beastly, more treacherous because of the horns. Of course, the horns actually represent wisdom. But overall, this is how the archetype plays itself out. So the same thing goes with these creatures. Okay, when we are looking at these creatures and experiencing these creatures, we are not able, unless you are somebody who is gifted in a psychic sense, and even in those cases, they will tend to still see things archetypally because that's just how the brain works.
Exactly.
But don't misunderstand that just because you're seeing something and represented archetypally doesn't mean it's less real or should be marginalized as just the figment of your imagination or some type of hallucination.
Basically, everything that is physical is a projection of the spiritual.
Yes.
But there are things that are spiritual that don't project a physical form.
Exactly. I love that. That's well said.
And that's what we're dealing with. And especially with sirens, one of the things about them before I got to throw this out there because, of course, we think of mermaids, but there's also the type of siren that is more like a harpy, where it's part woman, part owl. And these are, they're harbingers of death. They're singing you to your doom. They're luring you toward the rocks because they're seductive. It's that seductive call, that siren call of death.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of them are considered psychopomps. They're that transition phase between, the human and the spirit realm. So that's what they do, is they transition you, sometimes forcibly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, the siren is almost a type of jinn.
Yeah.
And I think it just this particular type of entity lives at sea, where the jinn, at least in how we're understanding it in pre-Islamic terms, is mostly a desert dwelling entity or elemental. A siren is the equivalent thing, only at sea, a water dwelling elemental. Probably very closely related to the core group of, you have the elementals. The gnomes, for example, are the core group of earth element. You got the salamanders and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so, this would sort of almost be like the earlier evolution of these creatures, and they get more sophisticated as they evolve out, just like we do. We are, evolution is the standard in creation. It really bugs the hell out of me when I hear Christians talk about creationism as if it's in contrast or in disagreement with evolution. It's like, I want to say, you morons, evolution is creation. Can't you see that? Don't you understand that creation is a process, and evolution is the process through which creation happens? They're not against each other. It's not a spectrum with two opposing sides. It's the same damn thing.
Yeah.
And it happens at the non-corporeal level as well as at the corporeal level. So that these spirits evolve. So you might have a creature like a gnome, which is a very rudimentary form of the earth element, but as that spawns out, it will manifest in more sophisticated forms, like what we would see as a desert jinn. And so sirens, I think, are the water version of them. I would put them in that category. Absolutely real, absolutely dangerous. I mean, even people like Leonardo da Vinci talked about them. You can't mean to tell me that the most brilliant mind of his generation, is making this up or just trying to be poetic. The thing is that people from earlier times were more connected to nature and had a better understanding of these forces. And
you think about people. You think about these people who spent their entire life on a boat on the sea. If they say they're hearing women singing, and it seems to be coming from nowhere, they're hearing something. Where is it coming from?
Yeah.
They're having that interaction. They're having that, spiritual connection, and it's manifesting in their ears as some kind of siren song.
Yeah. Which is, again, our brain trying to make sense of a spiritual reality.
Yes.
And we're just not really equipped for that. At least not yet. Well, I mean, in a sense, you could say that a human being is just not as developed. We're still more animal than we are spiritual. We're moving towards the spirit. So I will actually argue that at some point, barring Christian theology, just trying to talk about things in very neutral terms, I would argue that the final stage of human evolution, which I guess we could refer to as Homo, well, right now we're Homo sapien, but we could probably refer to that as, let's say, Homo completenda. I had a friend that used that term, and I always liked it. Completed man, Homo completenda, I would argue, would be almost entirely non-corporeal. I think we will reach a point where we won't need physical bodies anymore, because we will evolve beyond the need for them. And the universe is certainly, the cosmos itself is more non-corporeal than corporeal. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of that with physics, where we start to talk like astrophysics, and they're trying to understand what dark matter is. And, they describe it almost like a membrane that sort of holds the universe together, but they really don't understand it. Yeah, well, guess what? Dark matter is the rest of the universe. And the majority of the universe is dark matter. We just don't have any... Science doesn't know what to do with it. Why? Because science is absolutely unwilling to deal with anything spiritual and non-corporeal. They won't touch it. But dark matter is essentially where all that stuff resides. And so you might say that's the spiritual world. And it's all around us. Dark matter is even in the room with you. And of course it is. And
dun, dun, dun.
I know, right? and I mean, that actually explains a lot of people. I know that Zach Bagans on Ghost Adventures, I've heard him on certain episodes, ask the question, and, it's a good question. He's wanted to know, where did ghosts go? In his interactions, and all of us who do paranormal investigation have seen this. They seem to spawn into existence. You get all this activity, and then it just stops.
Yeah.
Where do they go? And the answer to that is there's nowhere to go. It's just energy comes into being and energy falls out of being like a breath. You inhale, you exhale, it comes and it goes. And the dark matter is like that. It just passes through. And so if you get the right formula of energy at the right time to interact with it, you're going to get all this activity, and you're going to say, wow, look at this, EVPs and all this electromagnetic activity, and we're getting and then all of a sudden it just passes back out. And no longer resonant with the particular environment. The vibrations aren't compatible anymore, and so you stop you start being able to make the connection. But they don't go anywhere. They're not like leaving. It's just it comes into being, and then it comes out of being. The connections, are formed, and then they break. So they're not like, it's not like I think people have this image of a spirit out there in the spiritual world, and they sort of come through this vortex or something, and then end up in your bedroom, and then they do all this stuff, and then they leave. They go back through the vortex and they go back to their realm. No, that's not what's really happening. It's about the alignment of our reality with theirs, and when those two values are equal, you have interaction. But most of the time they're not, which is why most of the time they can't interact with us and we can't interact with them. All places are haunted. I guarantee you there's thousands of spirits in your house right now with you. But the fact is, they are not resonating at a vibration that is anywhere close to the vibration that you're resonating at, so you're never going to be able to interact. And so they don't even know you're there. You don't even know they're there. And for all intents and purposes, they're not there. Neither are you, though. And that's how it works. We experience these things archetypally. So we're going to see the phoenix as this big red giant bird that rises from its ash. Any of those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to connect with that reality, that's what they will see. The archetype will be perfect. And it will manifest and project itself to our minds in a way that we can understand what it is. But that doesn't mean it really looks like that. But that also means the same to us. We don't really look like what we look like. We just look like what we think we look like. We can form. That's why sometimes we have diseases like body dysmorphia. People that, develop eating disorders because they think they look fat in the mirror, and they're not even fat, but they think they're fat. How does that happen? Because the brain creates the reality. You create who you want to be. Or sometimes you create who you don't want to be. And that's just the malleability of creation. And that's what it means to be created in God's image. That it doesn't mean that God has 2 hands, 2 legs, eyes, ears, and a nose. It means that you are a creator. And that's an awesome responsibility. And it's a lot more than most of us are capable of handling. I guess we can take a few minutes here and maybe cover any questions that come up. Joy, are there any questions out there?
Oh, goodness.
Anything that's worth covering? I'm sure there's so many. Probably all of them.
Well, I know one person asked if there were exorcists in other forms of religion, which there's
Oh yeah,
the exorcists in pretty much all of them.
Almost all of the major ones. Hinduism, Buddhism, even Taoism has a type of exorcist, although they don't call it that, but it's the same basic thing. Judaism, Islam, all has it. Of course, Christians are the most prolific, but that part of that's cultural. But yeah, I mean, there's an actual tool in Buddha in Vajrayana Buddhism called the Furba. I actually have one, and it is a demon that is contained within a blade, and the blade is used to cut other demons out and remove them. We've had to use it a couple times, not recently, but I have it in case I come across a spirit that's like that. So yeah, all exorcists in all religions, because all religions have some version of an evil spirit that can afflict a person at the level of an attachment.
Yeah, and Joe is asking about the use of a cross with a werewolf versus a crucifix. Do the movies have it wrong? I don't think it matters if it's a cross or a crucifix. It's the faith of the person wielding it, isn't it?
I mean, in general terms, yeah, I would say it is the faith of the person. Crucifixes, though, do have a certain sacramental grace that crosses do not. In fact, even to this day, there are those in the Catholic Church that feel that crosses are an inappropriate symbol without the corpus, because it's at that point you're just basically relegating it to an instrument of torture. Versus the dying Christ on the cross, which is the symbol of salvation itself, which is the very act that takes away the sins of the world and reconciles evil. Somebody was asking me about the incident that we had before I left for vacation, where I had an object in my I had a flash drive that contained very sensitive information regarding a demonic possession, and I needed to make sure that I didn't lose it, so I put it in the same case with my crucifix, not because I thought that the object had an attachment, but just because I knew I would see it, because I have to put my pectoral cross on for every Mass, and that way I wouldn't forget that I had it, and I would know what I needed to do with it once I got to my office. But it obviously had a demonic attachment, and it tore the crucifix box apart. It actually tore it into 3 pieces, and then it hid underneath the seats of my car to get away from the crucifix. And this person on Twitter asked why we always assume that it's the evil that's doing this. Why? Maybe it was the cross saying, that it wanted to get away. Maybe it was the cross that wanted to get away from the demon. And I said that's basically you're misunderstanding Christian theology, because crosses don't run from demons. Crosses seek them out. It reconciles evil. But that's because of the symbol of Christ dying for our sins. And when you just have the cross, you're kind of missing the whole point of the symbol. So I would argue that I would actually never go into any kind of situation where I had to attack a spirit, an evil spirit, without a crucifix. I would never use a cross. But in a bare bones situation, you could, in theory, a priest could take 2 sticks and tie them together and make a rudimentary cross and use that effectively, assuming he blesses it and uses it with the same intent that a crucifix would be used with. So, yes and no. Joy, you're right. I mean, it is ultimately the faith of the user. But on the other end, archetypes respond very strongly to certain archetypes. And there is no substitute for the dying Christ. None whatsoever. So, that's a powerful one that can have an effect. So if I was going up against an evil werewolf, I would want a crucifix, not a cross. But I've never met an evil. I've never met an evil werewolf. So
I've only met good ones. Well, they weren't always so nice, but
Well, most shamans tend to have a rough edge, but they're like almost like Zen masters. They're not there to make you friends; they're there to teach. But no, I've never met an evil werewolf. I don't associate them with evil at all.
No.
Are there any other ones there before we end for tonight? We're going a little over, but that's okay.
Somebody was asking about why the protection wasn't enough to re-scroll Jinn.
Why the protection?
I'm guessing that's probably the protections that you had up in your garage with the scroll.
The Gohazan. That's because I was not being diligent with resealing the area. Sealings, when you seal an area, ritually seal an area to create a temporary containment, they break down because it's basically just a layer of salt and oil and holy water. Holy water evaporates over time. Salt can be displaced by movement, and holy oil also can eventually dry and become less effective. And so, you want to keep applying those elements to a area that you're sealing to keep it fresh and make it resistant to anything getting out of that area that you're sealing off. But it only lasts for so long, and we waited way too long, and I was not being diligent with going down there. I don't want to make excuses, but I'm a very busy man, and honestly, I didn't think the Gohazan was going to be that nasty. I never met a Gohazan that was that nasty. Honestly, I've dealt with Gohazans before. This one was just nasty as hell. And,
well, it seems like you wanted to offer it a choice, but it already made its choice.
It did. I think it did. It wanted vengeance, and it wouldn't speak any other language. So it got what it deserved. It got what it cultivated. It cultivated evil. It got evil back, and that's just the way it had to be.
But
that's why.
One more person who asked a question.
Okay.
It's I find it interesting that every demon and every angel is a jinn, but not every jinn is an angel or demon.
Yeah, and that's actually a good way to put it. I hadn't thought about that, but that's actually kind of like a Venn diagram. And it's true because jinn, technically the core definition of a jinn would be any non-corporeal creature, which basically includes them all, every type of spirit, even the spirit of a dead, even the ghost of a loved one is a jinn at this point, kind of like almost like the kami in Shinto. Similar concept. It's the same kind of thing.
I can see that.
But angels are a very specific type. You could almost say an angel is a species of a non-corporeal being. So you could say that angels are a species of jinn. Kind of like you could say that we're a species of mammal. So you could argue that mammals are like jinn, and in that realm of mammals, you have humans, you can have hamsters, you can have all sorts of different creatures of varying levels of sophistication. They're all mammals. They all meet the criteria for being a mammal, but yet they're very different from each other. A human being has very little in common with a hamster.
It'd be like the different kingdoms. You have the invertebrates and the vertebrates, and the non-corporeal.
Yes.
And then from there, it just branches out.
It branches out. So, that's what that basically means. So you could say that an angel, is just a type of jinn, but, all non-corporeal creatures are jinn. So, it's just a more specific category within the realm of what we call jinn. Any other ones before we sign off?
I think that's it.
All right. Okay. Well, Joy, it's been a wonderful show. I really appreciate all your insights and everything else. And I want to thank all of you out there in the chat room for your participation in tonight's show, your wonderful questions, and your loyalty. Remember, if you like the show, please don't forget to give a donation to keep it on the air. It really helps us do this work. It helps this ministry. You can make your donation at nicoland.org or esotericcatholic.org. On the right-hand side, the right-hand margin, there's a donation button. Just click it, and you can give us whatever you can afford. Thank you so much, everyone. God bless you all, and I will talk to you. Actually, I will be on a show this Sunday. I think it's Paranormal Horizons, if I'm not mistaken. Let me give you the exact time just so that you know to watch it. It's this Sunday, Paranormal Horizons, this Sunday, September 9th at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay? So that's this Sunday. I'll be on Paranormal Horizons. You can listen to me then. But until then, we'll be back next week with another edition of Vestiges After Dark. We'll see you then. Take care. God bless.